Okay, good morning. My name is Ben Bingle, and I'm the Director of Grants in the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership, the DeKalb County Community Foundation. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on trends and strategic goal setting. We have a couple of housekeeping items to share before we get started. First, we're going to be recording today's webinar, and that recording will be sent to you later on by email along with an evaluation form so you can provide feedback about this training. We also have everyone muted, but feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom. We'll save some time at the end to address questions that you submit. And if you're more comfortable, you can send those directly to me via private chat if you'd like. And like usual, we'll plan to have around 45 minutes of content and then 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion at the end. So with that, we're really excited to offer this topic as we kick off our training for 2022. And leading us through this webinar is Matt Gayer, who's been a great friend to DCMP over the last couple of years. We're excited to have him back. Just a little bit about his background. Matt's the co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofits with the goal to create visibility for these organizations, to fuel their growth with philanthropic dollars, and create a movement for social good in the region. Before joining the catalog, Matt worked in healthcare consulting at the Advisory Board Company. He's a Truman Scholar. He holds a Master's of Public Administration degree with a focus on nonprofit management from Syracuse University. And he earned a bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Matt loves all things DC and enjoys exploring the hidden gems that the city has to offer. Welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here. Excited to have you all with us. We'll go ahead and dive on here in just a second. As Ben mentioned, my name is Matt, co-executive director at the Catalog. We work with a lot of small local grassroots organizations from across DC and now across the country in terms of capacity building. And right now, one of the big questions we have, and we get often, is how do I plan for 2022? And in general right now, probably just how do I plan? We live in such a time of uncertainty. Plans have to be really flexible. So we'll talk about that today, about how despite all the things we don't know, how do we focus on what we do know? And how do we make some type of strategy and plan for the year? A couple things before we dive into some specific trends to be aware of when planning for the year, and also some specific tips around kind of goal setting for 2022. At a high level, I think one thing we see that's really a theme at the beginning of this year is uncertainty, right? So in some ways, we find ourselves in a similar space as we did at the beginning of 2021, yet for very different reasons. There's reasons for optimism, but also concern, right? We think things are on an upward trajectory, but we know there's potential roadblocks and obstacles in the way. And that was true last year and true this year as well. So what we know is going to be a constant, and something we want to think about, and we'll talk about this a little bit when it comes to goal setting, is change, right? We know that the end of 2022 is unlikely to look exactly like the beginning. And for better or worse, it probably will be different. So how in a year that we know change is going to be constant, can we set goals? Can we engage staff? Can we kind of engage our board and make sure progress stays front and center? Second, second thing we know, we'll talk about this in the trends here in a second as well, is that folks are still really active. So despite all that change and despite the ongoing kind of difficulties and challenges folks are facing, donors in the community at large are still aware of the crisis we're facing, and generally we still see an uptick in kind of giving, volunteering engagement right now. So how do we take advantage of that opportunity to make sure that we're leveraging that engagement to move our work forward? And then finally, and we'll talk about this in the trends as well, so I won't dive too deep into it right now, but we are seeing kind of major donors, those with high net worth, giving more than they've given before. And that's a real opportunity for us, right? There's also some risk attached to it that we'll talk about here in a minute, but a real opportunity. And across today, when we're talking about goals for 2022, I think a theme we're hearing a lot of people talk about is finding the opportunities during this uncertain time. So not setting kind of wild goals for growth, because we don't know everything that's going to happen. But what are some specific areas that we feel good about that we can sustainably and strategically grow in, even when so much is unknown? So we'll start off with talking about some fundraising trends. We'll talk about a few trends kind of for organizations in general, and then we'll dive into goal setting for the year and some tips on doing that well. So the first fundraising trend we're going to talk about, and I'd be curious, feel free in the chat to put if for any of these trends you're seeing or feeling the opposite. If you have questions about any of these trends, we'll save time at the end, as was previously mentioned, to answer any of those questions, or we'll kind of bring them up as they come up. So this first trend, major donors are really engaged right now, right? So folks that come from high net worth households, we saw that their giving increased again in 2021. It obviously increased dramatically in 2020 compared to 2019 as well. And this giving still remains elevated. So we're still seeing top level donors give at top levels, increasing their giving. Why this is happening? It's for a few different reasons. And on an individual basis, right, it could be any or all of these. Part of it, though, is that we are hearing from major donors anecdotally that they're recognizing their privilege a bit more. Right, they're aware that they have the privilege to work remotely. They're aware they have the privilege to, be in a relatively safe community or to travel privately, right, or whatever it might be. But there's a little bit more awareness of some of the things that they have, and that's caused them to feel like they should be giving back more, right? So for these folks, talking about systems, talking about how your work works into this larger system of whatever is going on, is going to be engaging to them. They also are looking for those personal stories as well, to know that your work is kind of having an individual impact. Secondly, in typical disaster fundraising, right, giving usually drops when it's no longer top of mind. Not good for the country, but something that has kept giving elevated right now is that the crisis is still top of mind. Right, folks are still thinking about this on a daily basis. It definitely has not gone to the back of their mind yet. So as that remains true, donors have been giving more. Right, this is one thing to think about for 2022, and one trend we're going to stay on top of is that as things improve, as the weather warms, right, going into summer, and people are able to actually go outside, right, do outdoor events again. Are we going to see the crisis our community is facing go to the back of their mindset? Are we thinking about it less? Does that translate into lower giving, right? So that concern that kind of elevated disaster awareness drops before the need does is a real concern, right? We see this a lot of times with natural disasters. As soon as that hurricane is off the news cycle, people stop giving to it, even though the need is still there, and that very well may happen with this as well. So something to kind of be aware of and think about ahead of time. The tip from this and how we're interpreting this trend is engage your donors early this year, right? So donors are still really engaged right now. So let's reach out to them, start developing that relationship, doing some of that stewardship, getting them kind of feeling good about the organization and the pipeline while they're responsive, just in case they lose some urgency during the second half of the year. And then finally, we're seeing larger scale donors who often their giving was more national or at least regional before, looking for more and more local impact. So they're looking to make a difference in their community. They're increasingly wanting to know their dollars are making a difference for people where they live. So the more we can paint that picture, describe that work, have some client stories there, we're seeing major donors respond really positively to that. The second thing that kind of goes hand in hand with this that's been interesting to watch on the individual donor front. Again, this is at a national level, so I'd love to hear from folks in the chat about what their experience with this. But that we've seen individual giving as a whole, right? The number is bigger this year than before, right? So at a surface level, it looks like individual giving has increased, and it technically has. But that increase has been driven by those high net worth individuals we just talked about, right? The kind of 1% richest households are giving more. We've actually seen middle level and grassroots donors give less. So less people are giving as a whole, as kind of number of donors. Less smaller gifts and medium-sized gifts are being made, but our numbers look better because our highest net worth individuals are giving more than they have. In the short term, that's fine, right, for an organization, as long as we're still kind of bringing the money we need to. It's not a top of mind concern, but long term, right, those grassroots donors become our middle level donors. Those mid level donors become our major donors over time, right? And especially as our major donors kind of age out or have to reduce their giving over time, we rely on that base of support. Also has some impact on the community, right? If less people are philanthropically involved, that's also less people who might be aware of our work, then telling other people about our work. Obviously, benefits to having a large donor pool. So this trend is something we're going to be keeping a really close eye on in 2022 to see if people come back or if that kind of reduction in donors stays. It's something to be aware of and thinking about. So when thinking about the fact that less people are giving at lower levels, how do I kind of jumpstart that or kind of get that going again if I experience this? One of the biggest things is this audience may have some trust issues with organizations, right? We know there's a lot of mistrust the nonprofit sector a lot of times when people talk about it these days. We've seen increasingly the majority of people, like 60% when surveyed, have questions about how nonprofits manage their money. There's just a general public distrust, right, of public organizations right now. And this is an audience that we don't have the time to kind of meet one-on-one with, right? If someone's giving me $20 a year, I'm not going to sit down and have lunch with them, right? Because I don't have time or capacity to do so. So how do we build trust with a group that might be a little mistrustful of us and we can't sit down and do personal relationships with? So that's a big thing we're thinking about, right? How do we make sure our communications are clear, are concise, and we're going to engender that trust to them? The second thing here, we'll talk about this in a second also, I'll say, but peer-to-peer fundraising, why that's worked so well over these last couple of years is that transference of trust. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. The best way to kind of build this group right now is through that kind of peer-to-peer effort or some type of organic word-of-mouth effort, right? We can definitely do some paid marketing, but we see the kind of return on investment for that and the cost not really be realistic or worth it for most smaller organizations. So how do we get the people who currently know about us to tell other people? Because that is far and away the most effective marketing tactic we're seeing right now for organizations. And then finally, we want to make sure that for these smaller groups that as bigger donors are giving more money and they see that, sometimes they then increasingly feel their $20 or even $50 doesn't really make that big of a difference, right? Even their $100 doesn't make that big of a difference. As they're more aware of systems and the bigger things at play, they might feel like my one gift is insignificant. So it's really important we're making sure the language we're using is getting them excited, is driving home the fact that they're part of something, they're part of a community that's giving, and that $10, $20, $50 gift actually makes a huge difference to our work, and that we're really appreciative of it. We want to make sure that they're feeling that and feeling engaged. A couple of things to avoid here. We want to make sure that we don't just kind of accept this, right? So it's easy to kind of lose some of these donors and not feel a big impact on our bottom line right away. But again, these are also the folks who are our supporters, our advocates in the community. They show up to our events, they volunteer for us, they tell other people about us. So there's a lot of benefits to that $20 excited donor that goes beyond just the $20 that they donated. So it's really important we're thinking about that and thinking ahead of time how to keep them engaged. And we're still gathering data on this is the other thing I'll say too. This is an emerging trend. We don't know for sure if these people are kind of slowing their giving because of just compassion fatigue, right? It's been 2 years of disaster and urgency, and they just need a break, and they don't want to think about it right now. Is there some type of fear and uncertainty or confusion that's happening that's causing people to be a little bit more slow to give, right, or reticent to give? Is it economic uncertainty? All those things are at play, right? Inflation and everything else. And we don't know quite yet what the motivation is that's causing less people to give, but something to kind of stay on top of and be aware of. Our third trend here is really about being relational. So this was true in 2019. This was true in 2009, right? In 1999. But folks give to people, right? People give to people. They want to feel connected to the organization. They want to feel kind of personally invested. But more so than ever before, we see donors really want a sense of impact and a sense of community, right? So giving to you not only is going to make a difference in the community, but I'm going to feel like I'm part of a team, part of a community. There's still that sense of social isolation right now being higher than normal. So they're looking for a chance to feel connected. So a couple things around this, right, and how we can do that for donors, how we see organizations doing this. One tip is actually a lot of kind of local organizations are creating their own giving circles. So a giving circle, for context, if you haven't heard of the term before, is basically a group of people who agree to give a certain amount a year, right? It could be $100, it could be $1,000, and they pool their money, right? So if 10 of us are giving $100 each, we pool it, we have $1,000 now to donate, and then we collectively decide one organization, two organizations to get that money, right? So it's a way to take our somewhat smaller donations, pull them collectively, use kind of community wisdom to choose who gets the money, and give out some kind of grants from it. So often these exist independently, right? A lot of communities have these for different groups of folks or just different interested people. But increasingly, nonprofit organizations are creating their own, right? So getting 10 of their middle level donors who are giving kind of $200, $300 each year to get them all to agree to maybe give a slight upgrade to $400 or $500 and be part of a 10-person giving circle. They get to know each other really well. There's a social element to it, right? And they have a certain fundraising goal for the year. So that's something we've seen organizations do. It's an easy way to get people to feel encouraged to invite their friends to possibly give as well. We've seen this work all the way from the most grassroots level of like $20, $10 a year, up to folks asking people to give kind of 500 or 1,000. It's a little bit of work on our part to set up, right? But after initial setup, other than maybe like a quarterly or biannual kind of virtual gathering of this group, there's not much we have to do there. So it's a great way to get them feeling connected, a sense of community, but not a lot of maintenance work, which is something that we're looking for capacity-wise. The second big tip we want to say here around this trend of kind of donors wanting to be more and more relational, that again kind of mirrors giving circles a bit, is peer-to-peer, right? So getting folks to go out there and get people to give to you from beyond kind of your personal network, tapping into their network. This transference of trust, right, is key to why this works. And this is the #1 donor acquisition strategy right now in terms of getting new people to give to your organization. During disaster fundraising or a time of crisis, an urgent time, we find people typically only give to organizations they already know pretty well, right? Because they're stressed, they don't want to do research on a new organization or anything like that. Why peer-to-peer though works during a time like this is that new donor maybe still doesn't really trust you, but they do trust their friend who asked to give on their behalf, right? So having that person go out to their network and ask, their network trusts them, they transfer that trust to you, and they make that donation. And then it's on us, right, to steward those donors, keep them, and hopefully get them invested in the organization directly moving forward. So this could be used as part of a campaign or a general giving push. So you could run a peer-to-peer campaign entirely. It could just be part of some fundraising you do. That's something that we would say that end of year just got over. So most people aren't doing major fundraising campaigns for a couple months. But as early as kind of March through, I'd say like June would be a great time to bring this back and do this as part of some campaign that you're running and try to get a little bit of a peer-to-peer element there. If you haven't done a peer-to-peer campaign before, just starting with kind of 5 to 10 peer-to-peer leaders is a great number to aim for, and asking them to raise really specific goals, right? So ask them each to raise $500 and then giving them a pyramid of donors of, you need to get one person to give $100, 2 to give 50, right? 4 to give 25 each, but really helping them see how it's possible that success is going to make them more likely to do it again, right? It's going to be an easy win for us and an easy way to kind of test that out on kind of a small scale. The final note here about this relational trend I wanted to highlight is just it's not always donor programs. It's also the language we use, right? So we want to really talk about the community in our pitch. Make sure donors know that this is not an individual action that they're taking. They're donating to become part of our donor community, right? To become part of our overall organizational team, right? Using really donor-centric language. So they make sure that they both feel like they're driving the impact, but that they're also kind of stepping into something. Not that they're just kind of out there making a donation individually. Our fourth trend here that we want to highlight is just where we find donors at this time of year. So, at the beginning of 2022, how are donors feeling, right? Positive, negative, etc. The answer, not surprisingly, like probably many of us feel, it's a mixed bag, right? So some of the big things we're hearing from donors about how they're feeling right now, part of it is just fatigue, right? They are just tired of hearing about the need. They're tired that there is an elevated need, and a little bit of that generosity fatigue is beginning to set in, right? We're seeing this kind of an impact of this is the fact that our fundraising pitches need to be a little bit more about just like the need in the community and a little bit less COVID specific, because we're seeing donors are just a little tired, are beginning to be tired of responding to COVID pitches, right? Because they just don't want to think about it. So that fatigue is true, and setting it a bit for donors. There's a desire to get back to normal, even though it feels a little farther away right now. That'll probably come on stronger, especially as the weather warms into spring. So they're aware of the challenges, but tired of responding to kind of crisis mode. So again, this is where we want to pitch that there's need in the community, but a pitch that probably looks closer to a pitch from 2019 than it does from 2020 or 2021. There's still that really heightened sense of community. So at the same time, the fatigue and wanting normal is true, they also know that there's real need in the community and they want to be a part of the solution. So making sure we're using really donor-centric language and communal language there. There's more of a systems awareness than ever before. So talking at least briefly in our pitch about how our work ties into these bigger systems and disparities. Donors increasingly are surprisingly thinking about this in their giving. So mentioning it is going to be helpful to make sure that they feel like that's included and connected to that. We're seeing a lot of donors just kind of accept where we are now as kind of a new normal. So again, that is why we're seeing fundraising pitches that are most successful begin to mirror that kind of 2018 style more than the last 2 years, where this isn't necessarily a short-term crisis anymore. This is just, there is this need in our community. Help us address it, right? And then finally, in terms of tone, we get asked this a lot, our donors feeling positive or negative. Both is the answer there, right? Which again, probably many of us feel as well. Some are looking at 2022 as kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Things are bound to get better. Others can't believe we're entering a third year of this and can't really kind of think positively or negatively anymore, right? They're just not thinking ahead. Probably the biggest takeaway from that is that last point. Folks have a pretty short-term horizon in terms of what they're thinking about. So they're going to want to hear about your goals for this year, right? Not many donors are asking, what's your 3-year plan right now, right? They can't necessarily think that far ahead. So when we talk about goals here in just a second, we'll be talking about goals for the year that both are going to be important to guide your work, but also important to communicate out to donors and to the broader community. And then finally, on the institutional front, on the foundation front, I'll just say we see giving being pretty stable here. So there's not a lot of emergency funds available anymore. So foundations and institutional funding, government funding has largely kind of stopped on the emergency front. But we also have seen giving kind of be pretty stable. So it hasn't decreased. We haven't seen endowments take a hit. The stock market's actually been positive. So early indicators are for a fairly normal grant year in terms of volume. We haven't seen a lot of issue shifts either. So foundations that were funding something before 2020 are largely still funding it now and are back to kind of those normal funding priorities. But we are seeing more and more from small to national foundations include some type of focus on racial justice in their grant applications. So having a really strong answer about how equity impacts your work, how you think about racial justice in your work, is going to be increasingly important for institutional funding, as the majority of foundations will be asking about it in the coming year, if they're not already. And then finally, we are seeing folks be pretty understanding here. So might be applying for grants and have really, kind of weird finances from the last couple of years, right? The numbers look off. Your programming numbers are all over the place, right? In terms of how many people you're serving or the type of program you're delivering. We've seen institutional funders be pretty flexible in that, pretty understanding that that's just the reality that we're in. So the biggest thing we advise there is just being really open and upfront about that. So like, yes, this one year we took a 50% revenue hit because we weren't working in schools, but now we're back to it, right? Or this year our programming numbers went down because we were working virtually, but now we're working hybrid and the numbers are expected to be 75% of what they used to be, right? Whatever that might be for you, just being open and upfront about that. And we see most institutional funders be pretty willing to be flexible there and understanding why those numbers might have shifted. So with that, we'll shift the rest of our time to talking about goal setting. So set some kind of annual goals for this year, kind of what goals to set, and how to kind of create goals we actually are going to use at the organization. So a couple of things here. The first is that we really want to make sure that any goals we're setting are starting from thinking about our people at the organization, right? Our staff, our board, partners that we work with. We want to make sure that communication is open and honest with them kind of early on. So for the board, we want to make sure that they know ahead of time kind of what decisions we're going to be making this year, right? What goals might we be setting? What are some of the big decision points we might be making? And one of the big things for them also is helping them know, one common thing we'll talk about when we're talking about goals today is that we're doing this in a very uncertain environment. If I set 3 goals right now for the end of 2022, it's likely that at least one of them is going to have to change because something happens in 2022 that I couldn't foresee, right? Or that I didn't foresee. So it's important to make sure that the board, from a leadership perspective, understands, hey, look, this is our programming goal, but if schools go back virtual, this is what that would mean for us, right? Or if we can't do our summer camp in person, it's going to lower the number of students we can teach by this amount. So helping them understand those scenarios ahead of time, what would trigger those scenarios, so that they can be on the lookout for that along with you from a leadership perspective. For staff, the big thing is really helping them have a sense of clarity about what work life is going to look like. So they're going to be open to a lot of our program goals. They're going to understand the flexibility required there. We see a lot of staff have some anxiety and stress around and want to know where will I be doing this work, right? Are we going to be in the office? Are we changing offices? Am I working from home? If we are back, what flexibility do I have there? What if, schools are closed, but I'm back in person? So there's a lot of personal questions there for staff about how the work's getting done. The more we can answer those, the more they're going to be on board with the larger goals that we're setting. And then finally, for partners or other organizations we work with, we just want to make sure there's a really clear line of communication. Again, if we've learned anything from these past 2 years, is the situation can change very rapidly. So we want to make sure that we are prepared to communicate with those partners by having kind of clear line communication and a plan for when we would talk about shifting what we're doing. When we think about some of the goals we'll be talking about today and kind of setting some different goals for our annual plan, one of the biggest things is thinking about how we're engaging our staff with this level of change. So something we'll talk about probably a couple times in the next few minutes is that just because we could set a goal for growth doesn't mean we should. right? So just because I could grow my programming even more than I have, doesn't mean it's the right decision for the organization, right? Just because we could go after more donors or foundations or write more grants doesn't mean it's the right decision. And why it might not be is that my staff might just be exhausted, right? So we're seeing a lot of staff engagement concerns in the nonprofit sector, a lot of turnover in the space right now. We know hiring is really difficult right now. The staff that we do have, we need to be cognizant of and aware that they've been undergoing kind of 2 years, right, of constant change, of back and forth shifts, right, of uncertainty for 2+ years now. And that level of kind of stress and anxiety that causes means that they're less willing or able to kind of step into big scale changes this year. So we want to be really cognizant that if we are rolling out new programming, if we're targeting kind of aggressive expansion, right, or something like that, do we have the resources in place? Do we have the engagement in place from the team? Can we maybe roll out some of those big changes? We definitely want to take advantage of opportunities, but some of those should we maybe wait a little bit to announce, or wait another year to do, to make sure we're not overwhelming our team. So a couple of things, if we are going to talk to our staff about change, right, and do so in a way that keeps them engaged, we want to start with talking with them about the things we know, right? There's going to be uncertainty around any change, and naturally, if they're stressed, their head's going to go to all the things they don't yet know, right? Like if we're going to grow the program, how are we going to do X, Y, or Z? So making sure we start with the things we do, outlining those factors that we can define for them, and helping them kind of understand the context behind why we're trying to grow. When it comes to actually goal setting, right, and putting an actual metric on it, right, we want to be in 3 more schools. We want to serve another 100 people. We want to raise another $10,000. We want to let staff know that those goals are kind of flexible in most cases, right? So we set those goals, but that's really a benchmark for us to kind of North Star to try to aim for. So we want to be clear with the team to understand that, look, things are going to happen along the way that maybe would make that goal completely impossible, right? Or maybe we shoot past that goal and double it. Either way, we know that the process is going to be uncertain this year. So we're going to go for those goals, but we're going to be flexible in our understanding if they are or not achieved, right? So they have a little bit less anxiety about trying to hit something that they may be uncertain if they can. Then finally, we want to be really specific in our communication to them about what is changing. Again, so they don't feel like everything at the organization is going to be new, and they have a really specific focus on what's going to be different. A couple of tips for kind of setting goals with our board, and getting our board involved in this process. The biggest thing is that we're prepping our board ahead of time. We don't want to enter into the board meeting and that be the first time board members are thinking about the decision we're trying to make. So if at all possible, sending relevant materials ahead of time, getting some type of engagement from them on that would be really important and kind of beneficial. We want to try to keep the conversation pretty focused and defined. So we often encourage folks at their board meetings to have kind of 1 to 2 strategic conversations about different topics or decisions facing your organization or opportunities. If you're talking about goals with your board, being really specific about what is and isn't part of the conversation. And finally, trying to decide, do I really need to talk to the whole board about this, or is this a conversation I have with the committee of the board? So not every goal we set for the organization needs to necessarily be a whole board voted on approved goal. What level of leadership do I actually need to engage here? 2 things to avoid often we're talking about goal setting with board. One of those is just kind of the opposite of specific. We don't want to just ask the board, like, hey, what do you think we should do this year, right? We want them responding to something, keeping the conversation really focused. And we want to try to engage some board leaders ahead of time, because that's going to ensure that some folks are kind of ready for the conversation, right? So just going in there kind of solo means that folks might not have prepped, might not be prepared. So making sure we're talking to at least a couple of board members ahead of time is going to be helpful with that. In terms of what goals are we setting, right? Where should we actually be thinking about trying to set goals for the organization? And again, these are annual goals, so things we want to have done roughly on December 31st, right? Or if our fiscal year is different than calendar year, setting a goal for the fiscal year that's coming up. Programming, this is an obvious one. This is our kind of impact bucket. This is really thinking about where do we want to be in terms of outputs or outcomes at the end of the year, right? How many people do we want to serve? How do we want to serve them? Where do we want to see our programs grow this year? Is that growth either driven by serving more people, or we're serving the same people, but we're serving them more deeply, right? Or with higher quality services. At the same time, based on that kind of change management part we were just talking about, where do we want to strategically slow down a bit? It is 100% acceptable, especially right now when sometimes we have hiring issues in smaller teams. Sometimes teams are just disengaged and exhausted, burnt out. We might want to strategically slow down some programs, right? Saying, hey, this year we're actually not going to expand to a new school. We're not going to add that other volunteer slot. We're actually going to just maintain that at a high level, but give our staff a little bit of a break there. We talk a lot with burnout and kind of staff engagement about how to take things off folks' plate, but at some point, if we're really aggressively growing the organization, those things have to go on someone's plate, right? So thinking about at the strategy and kind of growth level, do I need to slow some things down to give people some space? In terms of development, kind of fundraising and communications, our big tip here would be go beyond just the dollars, right? So obviously we'll have goals in the budget or already do about how much money we need to raise this year. But thinking kind of next level about kind of what type of donors do I want? When we say that, we often are talking about, do you want to focus on keeping the donors you have, right? So donor retention. Or do you want to focus on donor acquisition, right? Getting new donors in the door. Obviously, we'd like to do both. But we know with kind of small teams, right, often kind of no dedicated development person, we only have so much time, right? So we want to focus on donor retention and donor acquisition. I will say donor retention is kind of the cheaper, faster option there, right? It's always easier to keep the donor you have than to get a new one. Acquisition is difficult right now. So if you are kind of a small team that's feeling stressed, right, needs to prioritize something, donor retention would be where I would focus in 2022. What types of gifts do you want, right? So this could be recurring, this could be major gifts. You could just be focused on increasing the average size of the gift you get, but thinking about what type of giving is actually happening. Then in terms of communications or fundraising, where do you want to grow your audience, right? We want to get younger folks kind of engaged on our newsletter. We want to grow a certain social media channel for awareness. We want to get people from this part of the community more engaged because geographically they're not very involved right now. Whatever that might be, but thinking about who your audience is. Then the final kind of bucket of goals to set is around internal stuff, right? So operations, finance, HR, culture, anything kind of internal to the organization. Our goal here typically with these goals that we're setting are either reducing pain points for staff, right? Slash kind of making opportunities for staff, or eliminating waste, right? Becoming more efficient. So thinking through, can I set some goals around team engagement? Can I set some goals around how we get our work done? And what would make our finances more sustainable, right? So those type of sustainability, efficiency, and kind of pain point type questions. I would say overall, for most organizations, setting no more than kind of 3 program goals, 2 or 3 development goals, and kind of 1 or 2 internal goals would be where I'd start, with maybe kind of 5 or 6 across all 3 of these. The final kind of 3 tips here we'll cover before we kind of pause for questions from folks are kind of evaluating the goals I set, right? So if I'm setting goals based off some of the trends and other things we're hearing for this year, how can I know if they're kind of a good goal, quote unquote? One of those, and many of y'all have probably heard this acronym before, but are they SMART goals? So this is kind of an easy kind of, review process to kind of remember. We're thinking about, are our goals kind of really specific and written in plain language? What the big thing there is making sure we're setting goals that anyone in the organization can understand. I want to make sure all of my staff are bought into the goals for this year, even if it doesn't relate to them, right? So if I'm setting a goal around donor retention, I want to make sure my program team knows, hey, this year we're going to be really focused on trying to keep the people we got supporting us, right? So I want to make sure I write that in a way that's empowering. That programming goals are going to make sense to internal and development staff. Internal development goals are going to make sense to program staff, and the whole organization kind of stay focused on them. Secondly, is it measurable, right? So I will say most time folks are pretty good at this now, adding some type of actual metric to it, right? So a goal would not be like my team is happier if I don't have a way, if I don't do kind of staff surveys, right, to like see how they're feeling or stuff. So it has to be something I can actually measure, something I can put an evaluation to. The big thing there I'll say though is that not just that there's a number tied to it, that you can actually track that number, right? So we hear a lot of times one of the development goals is I want to get younger donors, right? Which we can do a whole nother webinar on like why that probably isn't the priority you want to set. But so I want to get younger donors, but I don't currently ask my donors their age at all, right? Or I don't ask for birth date or something. Then it quickly gets so, well, how are you going to do that, right? How are we going to actually assess the data? So even though the goal itself, I want to get 30 new people under the age of 40 to donate, if I don't have a way to actually track that, then it's not very measurable. So making sure it both is specific, but then also we have a way to actually track it. Is the goal something within our control, right? So action oriented. So this is really something that we're talking about. Can we actually control it? Can we actually do something about it? So this hits a lot of times in the development space, making sure that we actually have something that if we're just increasing fundraising rate, I want to get a $100,000 donor this year. I may not be able to actually control that, right? That's a pretty big thing. But I can definitely reach out to 10 potential major donors, and I can control that part of it. So setting goals around the workflow, not necessarily the outcome. Is it realistic? We'll talk more about that in just a second. And is it time bound, right? Do I have a date when I want to go by? In terms of being realistic, diving a little deeper onto that, the big areas where we see goals are unrealistic for local and small nonprofits. One of these, and we've gotten better at this, but we still can get better moving forward. It's just thinking about the people power and people time it's requiring to achieve this goal. If I want to double my programming, am I adding programming staff, or am I asking my programming staff just do twice as much work? Really thinking about, do we have the right amount of folks to achieve the goals we're trying to set? Secondly, this one often is not really thought of, but it's really important. Do we have the knowledge on the team to set this aggressive of a goal, right? If we have, someone on the side managing our social media as a small part of their job who has no kind of professional experience in social media, right, is learning on the go, is it realistic to set a goal of rapid growth in our social media audience? Maybe, but maybe not, right? So we want to think about, do we have the experience, background, and training to carry out this goal, or do we need to give ourselves some time for a learning curve? Upfront cost, so can we actually incur the kind of cost it's going to take to kind of get this thing started? This is often true in development, right? So you can think about direct mail campaigns. Do I have the money to spend to get this campaign off the ground that might then pay for itself later? So that kind of risk tolerance and also just the actual resources. Do we have the technology to do the thing we're trying to do? Is often really important, especially on programming or development. And then finally, probably most importantly beyond all these, is do we have the buy-in, right? So is our staff really fired up and behind this kind of concentrated growth effort? Is our board going to help with our fundraising goals, making sure there's real buy-in to it? And the final tip before we pause for questions, just thinking about the type of goals we're picking. So again, back to that change management point and the fact that our teams are tired, they're exhausted, they have a lot on their plates. We don't want to just make 5 goals that are all super aggressive, right? So this graph here, this little 2x2, compares effort, right? So effort could be resources, costs, right? It could be staff time, be staff stress, but the things we're putting into it to get an initiative done. And the horizontal axis there is impact, right? The difference it's going to make. So a lot of times organizations will focus only on this kind of top bucket of strategic goals, right? So potential game-changing, high-impact goals that can make a really big difference, we're also going to take a lot of time and effort. We really can only have one or two of these going on at a time, because more than that is just going to be too much for staff, right? And too much for the organization. Even if certain staff are only working on one of them, if I set 4 strategic goals, 4 strategic kind of change-based goals for the year, that's going to be a lot for the team to kind of handle emotionally, right? That's changing at the organization. So it's important to think about what are 1 or 2 of those that we then can mix some of these others in, right? We're typically avoiding money pit changes. These are things that aren't going to make a big difference, but are going to cost a lot. We're probably only doing those if it's like absolutely necessary, right? So it's not going to make a big difference. The difference is required. A lot of times this is because of some type of regulation that might have got passed. But typically we're kind of skipping those. Easy wins. This is like kind of the antidote to the strategic change, right? So we want to get a mix of easy wins and strategic as much as possible. If we don't have any easy wins, because those are sometimes hard to find, we can pull from that rainy day bucket, right? They're not that hard to do. They're not going to make a big difference, but we can count it as a win. Because along the way, if we're doing these strategic changes that are going to take 9, 10, 12 months to do, if not longer, and be a really big effort, we need to have something to celebrate, right? So ideally, we're pulling from the easy win bucket. But if we don't have something there, we're at least pulling from that rainy day bucket, where we're doing something not that hard, not going to make a big difference, but we can celebrate it, and the team can feel that sense of progress. So with that, I'll just say these are a couple kind of next steps around kind of goal setting for the year, in terms of kind of forecasting for the year, thinking about what roadblocks might happen for the goals I'm setting, getting feedback from our team early and often about these goals, making sure there's a quarterly review process because things will shift across the year. So I want to make sure we're adapting to that. Thinking about how the team is feeling going into any of these big changes that we're announcing and making sure we have the engagement we need to do them. Keeping on top of trends that are happening. And then finally, writing these goals down and sharing them with the team and board. There is data out there that really does suggest just writing down goals makes you more likely to achieve them. So it's an easy first step. Something that's going to make us feel a little more accountable to it. Hopefully, it's an engaging process for the team and board. So with that, I'll pause here for any questions you all have about either the trends or goal setting for this year.
Okay, thanks, Matt. A couple of questions have come in. One was for me, and just want to be clear again, we will be sharing the recording, and also we will share the slides that Matt has walked through. So those will be available to you by email a little later on. A couple of questions here for you, Matt. Our organization is not ready for a strategic planning for a variety of reasons. How can we get our board members on the same page to realize that a plan could help us in the long run?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first, I'd say a lot of organizations, either due to size or capacity, may just not be at the place to a full formal plan, and that's 100% okay. I think a lot of times because we can't do that, then we just stop thinking about setting any strategic goals. So I'd really encourage folks to think about how can we set just 3 goals for this year, right? And do that process with the board, and go through a conversation with the board about those, right? Have questions about it. And that's a good way to expose the board a little bit to what that strategic process is like. That maybe then in a year or two, you could actually sit down with them and talk about what it would be like to do an actual kind of 2 to 3 year strategic plan.
This person says, we're all voluntary and very small. What's the best way for an organization just starting out to dip our toes in goal setting?
Definitely. I think, for those different buckets, right? So programming, development, and internal, I would say just setting one goal in each of those, right? That you can kind of hold yourself to. We see a lot of times for volunteer-led organizations, those goals can be really helpful because as there's turnover, right, that naturally happens as people have more or less to do, or as more people come on board, those goals can be kind of North Stars, right, and help orient folks pretty quickly to the organization. So I would set one goal, each of those 3, and move towards that.
This person says, I like your slide about making decisions with the board. What thoughts do you have about board members who do prefer that most decisions come before the board? How can we shift that culture so there's more autonomy at the staff level?
Definitely. And this is something we saw happen for some organizations as a result of the pandemic. The board got more involved in the day to day because the day to day was strategic, right? And now that the autonomy should be back with staff, the board maybe hasn't taken that step back. So I think the big thing there is talking with the board leadership, chair and exec committee. If you have an engaged chair and exec committee, about what the board role is and what the staff role is. It's really helping remind them that they're there for governance, they're there for strategy, but they're not there necessarily to do the day to day. And for some board members, that's going to be a shift. So not an easy conversation to have, but a conversation we need to bring up, hopefully at first with board leadership, and then ultimately with the whole board.
Yeah. And I'll just draw people's attention to the 3-part board governance series that Matt led for us last August. And so if your board is looking for a refresher, that's a great resource. And certainly included within that webinar series was quite a bit of content about roles and responsibilities. The final question that we have is, our strategic plan was basically put on hold in the last 2 years. I'm kind of weighing if we should scrap it at this point or try to adjust, but it feels outdated. Are you seeing this with the nonprofits that you work with, and what are they doing?
Definitely, yeah. We've seen organizations either pause, so they were supposed to do a strat plan a couple of years ago, right, and haven't during all this upheaval, or just like you're saying there, they had a 3 or 5 year plan. They made it in 2019 or 18, right? And the world's a very different place. So I would say we've seen a lot of organizations shift towards, excuse me, not doing a full new strategic plan right now, both because of capacity and time, but doing kind of a strategic update, I would say. So setting a 1 or 2 year horizon instead of 3 or 5, and setting some of these goals we're talking about, taking the goals they had maybe, and it might be as simple as just changing the metrics, or it might be as high level as changing the goals themselves, right? We have different priorities, we do different things now. But setting a shorter horizon, doing kind of more of a 1 to 2 year, here's where we want to go as we come out of this, with the goal being that if not this year, next year, there's enough certainty that they can re-enter that kind of formal planning process.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate it. And thanks for everybody who attended, and especially those who submitted questions. Some good discussion there. So to wrap things up, as I mentioned earlier, we'll send a follow-up evaluation by email along with the recording and the slides. Would love to hear your feedback about this training. We encourage you to visit dcmp.org and follow us on Facebook for upcoming trainings and opportunities. We do have quite a bit coming up. Next week on February 3rd, we'll feature Paul Lalonde, who's the Vice President of People and Culture at CEDA of Cook County. And he's going to present our Spring 2022 HR update. I know that's a topic that is front and center for many of you. And on February 9th, we'll offer our first Give DeKalb County webinar of 2022. You can register for both of those webinars by visiting dcmp.org. And we're also in the midst of accepting grant applications for multiple grant programs here at the DeKalb County Community Foundation. You can learn more about that, visit the grant guidelines, and look at deadlines by visiting DeKalbCCF.org. Once again, thank you for attending, and a big thank you goes to Matt Gare for sharing his time and expertise with all of us today. Thanks a lot, and take care.
There you go.